When I was a seminary student, all of the first year students were assigned to small peer groups that met every week or two for mutual spiritual support. And at one of these meetings, one of my group's younger members, most of us, many of us were second vocation students, but one of the group's younger members shared that she had just lost her grandmother, with whom she had been very close. She was an international student, so she was grieving alone, far from her family and the others who had also loved her grandmother. And another first-year student in the group, who was many years her senior, responded by saying, "As a Christian, though, I don't grieve when someone dies, because I believe in the resurrection." And I was watching the younger woman's face as he spoke, and I could see her sort of withdraw and fold in on herself. She had openly shared her grief with us, and he had shrugged it aside. Now, the older classmate, who perhaps I should mention did not remain in the program, his choice. The older classmate was convinced that he was offering a good Christian response to our friend's grief by telling her that it was unnecessary. In his mind, a lack of grief was a sign of faith. Many people, maybe most people, feel awkward or uncomfortable in the presence of death. In our culture, we don't talk about dying the same way that we don't talk about religion. And it is, after all, at the threshold of death that our different religions part company. Some to resurrection, some to reincarnation, some to earth and soil. And so words that may bring solace to one may ring false to another. And our hopes are too dear, and our hurts are too tender, and our beliefs are too uncertain to expose them to another person's rough touch. But in this season of Lent, such things perhaps cannot be avoided. Because if we cannot talk of death here in this season, then how can we claim to be a house of faith? And so we turn to Lazarus. What are we to make of today's story of this man emerging from the tomb wrapped up in bands of cloth like a mummy from a B horror film? The raising of Lazarus is one of those stories in the Bible that can be a little bit fraught with peril for a modern day preacher, because it has the potential to build a bridge or drive a wedge between its hearers and God. For some, this story touches on the very center of their faith, and for others it touches on the very center of their doubt. And so it may bring consolation to some and alienation to others. So we approach this story of Lazarus first not as good Christians, but merely as ourselves, whoever we may be. One of the things we learn from this story is that Lazarus is no stranger. He's not just someone that Jesus meets on his travels. He is the brother of Mary and Martha, two women mentioned frequently in the Gospels. They were not disciples who followed him on the road, but theirs was the home that he returned to on his journeys. He knew them well, they loved So when Lazarus is taken gravely ill, Martha naturally sends for Jesus. But Jesus doesn't come right away. Why not? Was this some necessary delay or a deliberate, dramatic pause? Did Jesus think he'd have more time? Or did he know it was already too late? John tends to, author of the Gospel of John, imagines, believes, portrays Jesus as being all-knowing, so in tune with God that he has a knowledge that other mortals do not. So John has Jesus declaring, this illness is for God's glory, so that the Son of Man may be glorified. Is Jesus really somehow cultivating this crisis and escalating it so he can play the Savior? Doesn't that seem sort of, I don't know, narcissistic? If Jesus loved them, wouldn't he want to spare them all that suffering? Or does he know something we don't? Whatever the reason for the delay, Jesus doesn't come right away. Looking closely at the narrative, it sounds like Lazarus may have been already dead by the time the message reached Jesus, but he was 4 days dead by the time Jesus got there. So first Mary and then Martha greet Jesus with these words, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. If only. When my mom was dying, my uncle came to visit her in the hospital. He had lost his wife, my mom's sister, just about 6 months earlier. Both were in their 60s. They both had ovarian cancer. My mom's last week was relatively peaceful as one can be in a hospital. My aunt, however, did not go gently into that good night. And so as my uncle and I sat talking in the hospital lounge together, he said to me, I don't know where God was when your aunt was dying, but he sure as hell wasn't in the hospital room with me. Or with her. If only you had been here. Wherever Jesus was at the moment that Lazarus died, he wasn't in that hospital room with him. But things have turned out differently if only he had been there. In our time and in our country, we live in such a death-denying country that dying starts to seem like some sort of aberration, an error. As if death must represent a failure on someone's part instead of a natural part of life. Like many people, I had feelings that, which I knew were irrational, but feelings that somehow my mom's death must be due to some failure on a doctor's part, or on mine, on God's, on hers. It is hard to forgive God for death. It is hard to embrace a universe that permits, actually requires, death. It is hard to trust in God's love when it seems God lets us slip right through God's fingers. Tiny hazelnut dropping. When one of my daughters was a baby just learning to stand, I came into her room to find her standing up in her crib and holding onto the railing. And I went over her to say, hi. I was going to go, hi. And she must have thought I was going to pick her up because she let go of the railing and went right over backward. And I will never forget the look on her face. It had obviously not occurred to her that I would let her fall. But fall she did, and I was too late to catch her. And in that moment, I'm not sure who was more upset, me or her. But she, of course, has forgotten all about this by now, but I haven't. If only I had been there. Whatever the reason, Jesus arrives too late to catch Lazarus. And Lazarus slips through God's fingers. When Jesus finally gets there, he reaches out and he lifts Lazarus up again. But in between the falling and the rising, there is the crying. There is the sorrow. Lazarus' sisters weep. Jesus weeps too. Why does he weep? He's already told his disciples that this illness is not to death. John, the author of this gospel, believes that somehow Jesus knows that Lazarus will rise. But in this moment, he weeps. I don't know whether he weeps for Lazarus or he weeps for the grieving sisters who are in such pain. Jesus weeps, and only then does he call him by name, Lazarus, arise. It's a puzzling tale, this story of Jesus and Lazarus. It resists being reduced to a platitudinous, one-sentence sermon takeaway. But if there is a moral to be drawn here, it is certainly not that grief is somehow unchristian. The story tells us that Jesus delivered Lazarus from the grave, but whatever miracle it was that occurred, whatever new life it was that stirred in Lazarus, however he was restored to his family's arms, his deliverance did not bypass the sorrow of death. Jesus never tells the mourners not to cry. He weeps with them. He joins with them in grief because he joins with them in love. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Shall be, after the mourning, all shall be well again. Empathy in the presence of grief is not easy. It is hard to go there. It is hard to know how to love a dying person. It is hard to know how to love a person who has died. It is hard to know how to be really present when death is in the room with us. It is hard to know how to settle our own fears in the face of grief. Death hurts, and death scares us, and so sometimes we shut it out. But when we do that, we shut out the grieving. We shut out the dying. We shut out the dead. One of the many morals to the story of Jesus and Lazarus is that weeping can be a sign of how much we love someone. See how much he loved him, people say. After my final semester of seminary, I completed a summer of chaplaincy training down at Bay State in Springfield. And I was assigned to the oncology and respiratory wards, so I saw many dying patients and many grieving families. But there's one family stands out in my mind. I had visited them earlier in the afternoon. There was a middle-aged man who was asleep or unconscious in the bed, surrounded at that point by his brother and his mother. The man's adult daughter had gone to the cafeteria for a moment. So I spoke briefly with the family, and they invited me to return later, perhaps when their daughter would be there. When I did, the nurse told me the patient had just died a few moments before. I entered the room and found the daughter there, sitting by her father's side, gently holding his hand. And her grandmother and uncle were also seated, and there was another seat there, and they invited me to sit as well. And the family then began to speak to one another with sadness but with great love about the one who had just died and about others who had died before. Family memories. I've never seen such peace in the presence of death. Everything in that room, their words, their voices, their posture, spoke only of love. Unshaken and enduring. Their beloved had died, but their love for him flowed on unchecked. And there may well have been tears later. I would be surprised if there were not. This is the hope that at the heart of this story. Not that love can prevent death, but that love can persist beyond it. That love can follow us into the grave. That even in the darkness of the tomb,